April 18, 1943. The Pacific is a steel blue sheet, and a line of American P-38 Lightnings flies so low over the waves that spray seems close enough to taste, racing toward Bougainville in the Solomons, modern Papua New Guinea just beyond the horizon of empire, because somewhere ahead, at a precise minute on a precise route, sits Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the face of Japan's naval war. This is Operation Vengeance, an assassination by mathematics. Decrypted Japanese communications turned the ocean into a timetable and the fighter pilots into the hands of a clock. In the formation is First Lieutenant Rex Barber, one of the men about to gamble his life on a single burst of fire that could echo across the entire Pacific. The mission is revenge, yes, but also strategy. Remove a rare commander with the authority to unite rivals, impose discipline, and keep a war machine believing in itself. When Yamamoto's plane falls, it is not just metal and flesh that hits the jungle. It is morale, myth, and a measure of Japan's confidence in its own future. And yet, at the very same moment Japan is losing leaders in the south, another world leader is fixated on a completely different direction, north, toward Siberia. Because in Berlin, Adolf Hitler is fighting an enemy he cannot finish quickly, and he becomes obsessed with one idea. If Japan would only drive into Soviet territory from the east, Stalin would be trapped, bled, and broken. The mystery is not that Hitler wanted it, it's why he begged for it, and why Tokyo, time after time, did not deliver. The Ghost of 1939. The border war that made Siberia look like a trap. To understand why Hitler's pleading fell on such stubborn ears, you have to rewind to a war most people barely remember. But Tokyo never forgot. The border clash of 1939 on the empty plains between Japanese-held Manchuria and Soviet-backed Mongolia, near the Khalkhin Gol River, what many call Nomonhan. It began as a small incident, patrols, claims over a line on a map, but it exploded into modern warfare, and the Japanese Kwantung Army discovered the hard way what it meant to fight the Red Army when Moscow chose to take the gloves off. Soviet armor, artillery concentration, and coordinated air power turned the steppe into a killing ground, and under commanders like Georgy Zhukov, the Soviets executed a brutal encirclement that punished Japanese doctrine and exposed its logistical limits. By the time the fighting ended in September 1939, Japan had suffered a shock that wasn't just measured in casualties. It was measured in confidence. The northern road suddenly looked less like opportunity and more like a steel trap that could swallow divisions whole. That defeat didn't merely sting. It reshaped Japan's internal argument about the future. Every time Hitler later demanded that Japan strike north into Siberia, the memory of 1939 rose like a ghost at the table, silent, undeniable, and persuasive, whispering that the Soviet Union was not China, not a colony, not an easy conquest, but a continental machine that could bite back harder than Japan could afford. Hitler's math, why Siberia was the shortcut to breaking Stalin. For Hitler, Siberia wasn't a romantic obsession. It was arithmetic, and the numbers on his chalkboard were written in blood. By the time Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Hitler had committed himself to a war he believed could only be won by speed, destroy the Soviet armies near the border, seize the economic heartlands, and collapse the state before its depth could matter. But the Soviet Union's greatest weapon was space, and the ability to trade territory for time while factories, fuel, and manpower kept moving east. In that logic, a Japanese invasion of Siberia wasn't a sideshow. It was the missing lever that could snap Stalin's system in half. A thrust from Manchuria toward the maritime province, the Amur region, or even the rail arteries feeding the Far East, threatened one thing above all: the Trans-Siberian lifeline that stitched the USSR together across 8 time zones. If Japan forced the Red Army to fight a second major front, Stalin would have to hold large forces in the east, divert aircraft, artillery and reserves, and, most importantly, lose the freedom to shift seasoned Siberian units west when Germany needed them not eventually, but now. Hitler's ideal outcome was simple. Moscow panics, Stalin splits his strength, German offensives regain momentum, and the Soviet state cracks under simultaneous pressure. That's why Berlin kept returning to the same demand with growing urgency, because when Barbarossa stopped being quick, Hitler's entire theory of victory started collapsing with it. A pact, not a command, what the tripartite alliance really promised. Hitler's problem was that alliances on paper don't automatically become obedience in war, and the tripartite pact of 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan, was far less of a unified command than propaganda suggested. Berlin imagined a single axis turning together, each partner pulling on the same chain to strangle the Allied world, but Tokyo saw something different, a political shield meant to deter the United States and Britain, not a contract that surrendered Japan's strategy to European demands. The pact was built around the idea of mutual support if one partner was attacked by a power not already in the war, an obvious warning to Washington, but it did not force Japan to invade Siberia simply because Germany wanted it, and it certainly didn't give Hitler operational authority over Japanese generals or admirals. Inside Japan, decision-making was fractured. The army and the navy competed for budgets, influence, and national direction, and neither service was eager to risk its future for Hitler's campaign on the other side of the world. So when Berlin asked, Tokyo could delay. When Berlin insisted, Tokyo could reinterpret. And when Hitler begged, Japan could nod politely while pursuing its own survival calculus. This was the central mismatch. Hitler treated Japan like a second blade meant to cut Stalin from the east, while Japan treated Germany like a distant partner whose victories were useful, but whose requests were optional. And because the alliance lacked a true joint command structure, every German message urging strike north entered a system designed to resist outside control, especially when the stakes were Japan's own empire, oil supply, and naval war. Barbarossa ignites the first time Hitler begged Tokyo to strike north. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Hitler didn't just open a front. He lit a fuse under his own expectations, and within days the pressure on Japan began to build. Berlin looked at the map and saw the perfect vice: German armies driving east through Ukraine and toward Moscow, while Japan, already sitting on the Soviet flank in Manchuria, could surge into Siberia and force Stalin into a nightmare of divided attention. Hitler's messages to Tokyo carried a clear assumption. The Soviet Union, shocked and staggering, was ripe for a second punch, and Japan could make that punch decisive by pinning down Red Army forces in the Far East, threatening Vladivostok, and choking the rail links that fed the Soviet war effort. But in Tokyo, the same map told a different story. Japan was already deep in China, already straining under shortages, already watching American embargo pressure tighten like a noose around oil and steel. A northern campaign demanded huge logistics across harsh terrain against an enemy they had tasted in 1939, and it offered no immediate solution to Japan's most urgent problem: fuel. Still, Hitler kept pushing because Barbarossa was supposed to end quickly, and every week mattered. If Japan struck while the Red Army was reeling, Stalin might never recover. This was the moment the begging began, not because Hitler lacked confidence in victory, but because he feared losing the one window when speed could still win the war. Tokyo's civil war of maps, Army strike north versus Navy strike south. Inside Japan, the decision Hitler wanted was trapped in a domestic battle more dangerous than any speech from Berlin, the long-running rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, each with its own vision of how Japan would become untouchable. The Army's traditional dream was the strike north concept: expand into the Soviet Far East, dominate the Asian continent, and secure strategic depth. The Navy's plan was the opposite. Strike south, seize the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies, and build a defensive perimeter across the Pacific that could make any American counterattack unbearably costly. By 1941, the Navy's argument was powered by one brutal fact: oil. Japan's war in China and its national economy depended on fuel supplies it did not control, and US-led embargo pressure made time feel like a closing door. Siberia offered cold land and hard fighting. The South offered tankers, refineries, rubber and tin, resources Japan believed it needed immediately to keep its empire alive. So even when Hitler demanded a northern invasion to help crush Stalin, Tokyo's strategic compass kept swinging toward the equator. The army could threaten, posture and mobilize along Manchuria's border, but without national unity, and without a clear, quick reward, it couldn't drag the whole empire into a second major land war. In effect, Hitler was asking Japan to choose Germany's victory over Japan's fuel, while Japan's leaders were calculating that without fuel, Japan would lose no matter what happened to Stalin. Stalin's silent advantage: spies, signals, and the Siberian divisions. While Hitler tried to pry Japan loose with persuasion, Stalin played a colder game. He didn't need Japan to love him. He only needed Tokyo to stay predictable. The Soviet Far East was a locked gate, and Stalin's fear was simple. If Japan attacked, Moscow would be forced to keep elite formations pinned in Siberia instead of feeding the furnace in the West. But by late 1941, something changed the calculus. Not hope, but information. Through intelligence networks and careful reading of Japan's strategic posture, Moscow gained growing confidence that Tokyo's priority was not Vladivostok, but the south: oil, shipping lanes, and a Pacific showdown. That certainty was priceless because it allowed Stalin to do something Hitler never wanted him to do: shift forces. The Siberian divisions became a symbol not of Russia's mystique, but of its flexibility. Troops trained for harsh conditions, moved thousands of miles, arriving as fresh, disciplined reserves at the moment the Soviet state needed them most. Hitler understood the danger of this even if he couldn't stop it. His entire argument for a Japanese invasion was to prevent Stalin from moving strength west. But Tokyo's reluctance created a strategic vacuum, and Stalin filled it with redeployment, preparation, and ruthless prioritization. In war, a leader rarely gets perfect news, yet here Stalin's advantage was that Japan's non-move became a move of its own, freeing Moscow to concentrate against Germany while keeping the Far East guarded just enough to deter the very attack Hitler was begging for. December 1941. Pearl Harbor slams the Siberia door shut. Then came December 1941, and the entire strategic geometry snapped into a new shape. With Pearl Harbor, Japan didn't merely begin a war with the United States, it committed itself to the southern road so completely that the northern option began to die in real time. A strike into Siberia was a grinding land campaign with no guarantee of quick victory. A strike south promised immediate access to the oil fields and resource arteries Japan believed it had to seize or suffocate. From Berlin's perspective, this was catastrophe dressed as triumph. Hitler welcomed America's entry into the war with reckless confidence, but he watched Japan spend its power on carriers, islands, and sea lanes instead of on Stalin's exposed flank. For Tokyo, the Pacific War demanded everything: ships, pilots, logistics, and political focus, because once the United States was in, Japan had to build a perimeter, hold it, and hope American willpower broke before Japanese fuel did. The result was that Siberia became not just unlikely, but strategically poisonous, opening a major front against the USSR, while fighting the United States and Britain risked stretching Japan into collapse. And for Stalin, this was liberation. Every Japanese plane launched toward the Pacific, every division angled toward Southeast Asia, was a silent confirmation that the East would not ignite, at least not now. Hitler's dream of a two-front vice against the Soviet Union didn't just fade after Pearl Harbor. It effectively slammed shut, locking him into the brutal truth that Germany would have to break Stalin largely alone. 1942. Hitler pleads again as the Eastern Front turns into a furnace. By 1942, the tone from Berlin hardened because the war Hitler expected to finish in months had become a furnace that consumed armies. Germany drove toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad, chasing oil, prestige, and the illusion that one more massive push could finally crack the Soviet spine. And as the Eastern Front widened into a continental brawl, Hitler's need for Japan to strike north returned, not as a clever opportunity, but as desperation disguised as strategy. Each Soviet reserve that appeared, each fresh formation that plugged a gap, felt to Berlin like proof that Stalin still had room to breathe. A Japanese invasion of Siberia, even limited, could have forced the Red Army to hold the Far East more tightly, complicated Soviet logistics, and threatened the Soviet Pacific outlet. So Hitler kept pressing again and again, trying to sell Tokyo the same vision: hit the USSR while Germany is engaged, force Stalin to split, and the whole Soviet structure will wobble. But Japan was now trapped in its own expanding war. The Navy's carriers had won dazzling early victories, yet those victories created commitments: garrisons, supply lines, constant convoy protection, and the United States was already converting industrial power into a tidal wave. Tokyo's leaders could see what Hitler refused to admit: that every additional front multiplied risk, and the Northern Campaign offered no oil, no quick payoff, and no guarantee of success. In 1942, Hitler wasn't begging because Japan owed him. He was begging because he could feel the war turning into a test of endurance, and endurance was the one contest he had not planned to fight. 1943. Yamamoto falls, and Japan's strategy becomes a locked room. April 1943 brings us back to that low-flying line of P-38s and the jungle waiting below, because Yamamoto's death was more than a headline. It was a turning of the key inside Japan's leadership. Operation Vengeance removed a commander who had not only planned Pearl Harbor, but who also carried rare strategic authority: the ability to argue, persuade, and steer a divided system. Without him, Japan's internal debates did not vanish. They intensified, and the Navy's war became even more consuming, even more defensive, even more focused on survival across a shrinking perimeter. In Berlin, the irony was sharp enough to cut. Hitler wanted Japan to open a northern front against Stalin, yet Japan was bleeding irreplaceable talent and tightening its grip on the south just to keep from drowning. By 1943, Invade Siberia wasn't a delayed option. It was a fantasy at odds with Japan's reality. The United States was accelerating. Allied submarines were strangling shipping, pilots were becoming harder to replace than ships, and every mile of ocean Japan had taken now had to be held under constant pressure. Even if Tokyo had wanted to satisfy Hitler's demand, the cost of a Siberian campaign, men, fuel, transport, artillery, winter equipment, was an investment Japan could no longer afford, because its war had become one of defense against industrial power. Yamamoto's fall symbolized a deeper truth. Japan's strategy was no longer a question of north or south, but of how long the empire could keep its balance at all. And that meant Hitler's pleas, by 1943, were no longer being rejected by debate. They were being rejected by circumstance. The verdict: the two-front war Hitler wanted, and the war Japan chose instead. So the verdict is colder than the myths. Hitler begged Japan to invade Siberia because his entire war against the Soviet Union depended on denying Stalin breathing room, denying him space, reserves, and the freedom to shift strength across a continent. And Japan was the one ally positioned to threaten that from the east. But Japan didn't refuse out of laziness or ignorance. It refused because its own strategic bloodstream ran on oil, and Siberia offered hardship without fuel, risk without certainty, and a memory of 1939 that warned the Red Army could punish any northern gamble. The Axis looked united in photographs, but it was never a single mind. Hitler fought for a racial empire in Europe and a quick annihilation in the East. Japan fought for resources and survival in the Pacific, and its navy and army were often fighting each other as much as they fought the Allies. When Pearl Harbor happened, the door to Siberia didn't just close, it locked, because Japan had chosen a war that demanded everything it had, and then more. And when Yamamoto fell in 1943, it was a symbol that Japan's war had become defensive, not expansive, too consumed to rescue Hitler's collapsing calculations. In the end, Hitler's pleas reveal the real Axis weakness, not lack of brutality, but lack of coherence. The war he wanted, Stalin trapped from both sides, never came. And so the opening image remains, a clockwork mission over the Pacific, while in Europe Hitler chased a second front that existed only in his imagination.